Good morning. This is Keith Coble, and I welcome you to the 2020 AAEA Rausser Keynote Forum. We have 4 speakers today that I think you will enjoy hearing their messages as we talk about sustainability, the interspace of food, agriculture, and the environment. Before we begin, I want to talk briefly about this event that this year, for the first time, that we have named as the Gordon Rausser Keynote event. Gordon Rausser is currently the Robert Gordon Sproul Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Dean Emeritus, College of Natural Resources, and a Professor of Graduate School at the University of California, Berkeley. On 3 separate occasions, he served as Chairman of the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. He served 2 terms as Dean of the College of Natural Resources and has served on the Board of Trustees of public universities and 1 private university. Over the years, he has been appointed to more than 20 boards of directors of both private and publicly traded companies, including chairman of a number of such boards. His federal government service included senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, in the Office of the President, chief economist of the Agency for International Development, and president of the Institute for Policy Reform. His editorship contributions include serving as editor of the AJAE, associate editor of the Journal of American Statistical Association, associate editor of Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, editor of Agricultural Management and Economics, co-editor of 4 volumes of the Handbook of Agricultural Economics, and more than 15 years as editor of the Annual Review of Resource Economics. He's a recipient of 31 professional awards, including Best Journal Article, Annual Best Published Awards, and publications of enduring quality from the AAEA. Outstanding research and leadership awards from other associations, such as the American Antitrust Institute, the European Association of Agricultural Economists, and the Agency for International Development. The event today is in honor of him on the part of the AAEA for being by naming the keynote address at our annual meetings from 2020 forward for his exceptional intellectual leadership and his mentoring of leading scholars. He was also honored in 2020 by permanently naming the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley for his visionary leadership and philanthropic contributions. More than 30 years ago, he was a resident fellow at Resources for the Future, a Fulbright Scholar in Australia, and named a fellow of the AAEA, the American Statistical Association, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In this virtual environment this year, we cannot personally recognize Dr. Rausser, but we hope at our next in-person annual events that we will be able to personally recognize him as we name this event in his honor. Today, I want to introduce our speakers as they are here. Oop, I just went too far forward. Let me move something. Okay. Shari Rogge-Fidler is the president and CEO of the Farm Foundation. You can read her biography here, but I've gotten to know Shari and her work with the Farm Foundation in recent years. She is very engaged in not only production agriculture, but all segments of the agribusiness world, and brings together a fascinating group of people to talk about the future of agriculture and the directions that we should go. I think she has a unique perspective on this issue that she will share with us today. Sally Rockey is with the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. Sally, again, is a thought leader about the future of agriculture and in the funding space where agriculture and applied economists can function. I think she will bring that perspective to our discussion today. Elena Irwin is from the Ohio State University. She's a member of the AAEA board And she brings a unique perspective, having served as a director of the Sustainability Center there at Ohio State University, and has tremendous engagement with other professions and sciences besides economics. And Emily Johannes with Nestlé is a person that I met some years ago here at Mississippi State University at a conference on sustainability. And Emily has now moved to Nestlé, working in the area of ethical sourcing, and will bring that perspective to our conversation today. So with that, I want to tell you the agenda. I'm going to ask this common question of all of our speakers that you can see there on your screen. I will have a second round of individual questions for each of our speakers. And in the third round, I will pick questions from the audience and pose them to the panel during this hour. With that, I will be quiet, and I will ask that Shari begin with the first. She can share her screen and make the first presentation.
Great, thank you, Keith. I'm in the process of sharing here. And Keith, can you confirm you can see my
Yes.
slide? All right. Great. Well, thank you, Keith, for the kind invitation to be here today. And thank you to AAEA for your resilience and perseverance to hold this event during these unusual times. I know that we will all benefit from our discussions together today. So first of all, for those of you who may not know Farm Foundation, just 30 seconds on Farm Foundation. We have positioned ourselves after all these years, since 1933, actually, it should say, as an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture. And I'll share an example later of what we mean by that. But one thing I wanted to call out here is that we are actually a multi-stakeholder and intergenerational group. And today, I'm delighted to say that we do have two of our premier programs with us listening and participating, our Farm Foundation Roundtable participants, many of whom are members of AAEA. And then we have our young ag scholars who are postgraduate students who are also with us today. So a shout out to them. Maybe they'll be future speakers in years to come. So in terms of what I would tell economists about the future of sustainability, I'm in this portion just going to share some overview thoughts and framing, and then later I'll be sharing some very specific examples. So in terms of what I would want to tell economists, I'd say words matter, incentives matter, and behaviors matter. So since I'm the first one out the gate, I thought I'd just get on the table the whole issue about definitions. So as any of us know who work in this space, definitions are one of our challenges since we don't really have alignment around the definitions. So I've just put some definitions here that are some working definitions that I use for sustainable agriculture. And then the additional challenge is now with regenerative ag in terms of sorting out how does that fit in to the whole scene here. And I actually polled our members before this to get their thoughts on my remarks. And the way our members of our roundtable think about this is regenerative ag being a subset of sustainable ag. And during our Q&A and during our discussion today, we can see if those of you with us today agree with some of these definitions or how you think about it. But I thought I'd get that out on the table first. Then in terms of incentives mattering, this is actually core to one of my challenges, and I think all of our challenges, and I'll come back to this in my examples. Here I'm highlighting a paper that was just launched in January of 2020 from the World Economic Forum and McKinsey in a joint initiative looking globally at our food system and highlighting some of the complexities and trade-offs around transforming our food system. And as it states there, the challenge is just the multiple actors that need to coordinate for change, and some of the issues that there's not one size fits all, whether it's across countries or even within our country, across the 2 million farms that we have here in the US. And then secondly, the trade-offs that happen. I mean, one of the things with incentives that you'll often hear me talk about is that farmers need clearer economic incentives to sustain some of their actions for sustainability. And to do that, some of the discussions are around, does the cost of food need to increase? Well, that exacerbates another issue about food equity and pricing. So that is one of the trade-offs that we need to keep talking about and wrestling with. And how do we create value and share value across the whole supply chain? Then in this paper, it highlights 4 different types of economic incentives: public investment policies, business model innovation, and institutional investment, and consumer behaviors. And I'll be sharing a little bit. I feel like there's been a significant amount on the latter 2, but we need to focus more on research and discussion around public investments and policies, around incentives for sustainability, and business model innovation. And as I said, I'll be sharing a few examples of that later this morning. Then last, in terms of behaviors mattering, one of the issues there, and we discussed a little bit as speakers before our call, is that in some ways, sustainability has been around for a while, and there's been some early adopters doing a lot of things. And Emily will be sharing many of the great things Nestlé has been doing. There have been lots of corporations doing sustainability programs globally. So that is significant. Consumers, and I'll be sharing more about this, I think are what may be at a tipping point, which is pretty exciting. And I'll be sharing some research about what I mean by that. But the combination of millennials driving some of the consumer behaviors and our global middle class now being at greater than 50%, those 2 things I think are helping us be at this tipping point. And as I said, I'll share some examples later. Then as to farmers, farmers have been leading the way, and in some way there is some fatigue of some of the real early adopters who did take some actions for sustainability on farm, but then felt that they didn't get the economic payback on it, so may be waiting on the sidelines to do more. And I think we need to focus on really shifting from the early adopter phase to scaling farmer adoption of sustainability and how we're going to create and share that economic value across the supply chain. So Keith, I think for now, that will be my remarks for now, and then I'll come back with some specific examples later.
Okay, thank you very much. Sally, would you go next?
I am going to share my screen, so if you can let me share my screen, I'll do that. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, I'm Sally Rockey. I am the Executive Director of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Thank you for having me today and having this virtual meeting. I am not an economist, so you have to take what I say with a grain of salt here, but I do want to talk about the involvement of economists and economics in our programs that I'll be talking about later with funding opportunities. But just to give you just a little background, one of the reasons that we're in ag science is that this is really an unprecedented time, that agricultural science makes a difference probably faster than any other kind of discipline in science. So we see that within 2 years and up to 30 years, research in agriculture, it can be applied out in the field. And that's really breathtaking when you think about it compared to some other areas. But our little foundation came about because if you look at federal funding in agriculture, you see this bottom blue line here where the arrow is, only about 2% of all research and development in the federal government goes to agriculture. So we represent a very small proportion. And when they developed FAR in the 2014 Farm Bill, our foundation, the idea was to take advantage of what's going on in the private sector, which actually eclipses the amount of money invested from the public sector, take advantage of this private sector funding and develop public-private partnerships between ourselves and the federal government and the federal funds and the private sector. So that's how FAR came about. We build these unique partnerships. We are a 501c3 foundation, but we build public-private partnerships to address the challenges. And we have this just really wonderful vision where we envision a world in which ever innovating and collaborative science provides every person access to affordable food grown on thriving farms, nutritional food. So we received $200 million in the original Farm Bill, another $185 in the 2018 Farm Bill. So we must match that funding with non-federal funds. And that really is this unique partnership that we have and this unique model for funding. And while there are a number of federal agencies that have foundations associated with them, and USDA is our closest collaborators. We also work independent of the USDA as well. So we can work very nimbly because we're not a federal agency, and we really like to think about those research gaps. And when we think about economics, one of the areas that we often seek out in our programs is that economic component, because there are many research gaps when you bring the biological sciences and the economic sciences together. We have a number of challenge areas, the major parts, but you see our bedrock of what we work on is thriving farms, environmental resilience, and well-being. And we have worked with just tons and tons of organizations, over 400 distinct funding partners in the last couple years. So we really have taken to heart this idea that we're going to bring public-private partnerships together. So let me stop sharing my screen and just mention for a few minutes about the idea about economics and sustainable agriculture. If you think about it, when I think about it, I really don't think about sustainability. I actually think about transformation, and that when we think about sustainable agriculture, sort of represents status quo, but we really want to transform our systems. And so we often think about, with sustainable agriculture, the three components: food security, environmental sustainability, and economic development. And we tend to focus on the physical or biological relationships. And that's why that last piece, the economic development piece, is so really absolutely critical. And oftentimes economic viability on farm is so necessary for sustainable agriculture. And profitability is what we study most, but there's much more to it. It's much more than profitability. I really think about economics as a study of how people attempt to meet unlimited wants with limited means. So the things that people care about and oftentimes can't be sold in the markets, right? So we think about these kind of things such as health and environmental quality, the things that we really value in our communities. And I think economics offers often ways to measure these more hard to quantify types of values. And so some of the more classical things we're thinking about in the sustainable world are profitability, environmental profit and trade-offs, environmental indicators, environmental values, health and its values of health to us, and marketing and business planning. All of those things can be addressed through economics. So I think there's a great opportunity here to think about economics as a way to measure some of these hard to quantify values. And I appreciate that approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities that we have in the next question.
Okay, Emily?
Thank you, Keith, and thank you to the AAEA for having me today and having this panel. I wanted to share from my perspective as the category manager at Nestlé for ethical sourcing. It's my role to work with our supply chains to achieve exactly the commitments and ambitions and goals that Shari and Sally have been talking about, that we're going to talk about more in this panel. And what I really focused on in thinking about this question for what do economists need to know about where sustainability is heading in the future, I really thought about what's happening right now. And right now, climate action for our company and for the private sector is accelerating. We set an ambitious goal in late 2019 to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 throughout our entire supply chain and company. And so to provide some perspective on how large this goal is, Nestlé is a global food and beverage and pet care company. We've been around for over 150 years. We sell products in over 187 countries and typically generate every year about 92 billion Swiss francs in sales. That's what we achieved in 2019. And so as we think about our company and where we're going in the future and our supply chains that we work with, climate change is already having a global impact on us. And so we know that in order to provide food, we have to work with food and agriculture and with our supply chains to build resilience in that system. That's really the key to our strategy around achieving a climate commitment is to be resilient. In fact, more than 90% of our greenhouse gas emissions as a company occur along our value chain. So that's both a risk and an opportunity to us as a company, and why we're so focused on working with our supply chain to achieve our goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So how are we going to do this, and what's the role that economists and economic science can play in this? Is that to do this, we have to generate value by a range of product developments and collaboration with our supply chains in food and agriculture. And to both Shari and Sally's point, we can't wait. We have the opportunity right now to achieve our target. So yes, our target is by 2050, but really it requires action right now in the next 5 or 10 years, because we can't wait until 40 years from now to achieve this. So we have to really act now. And so that's where the role of economics and economic science can play. Because to be honest, first of all, to get there, we have to break through the unknowns. There are a lot of unknowns to achieve the goals that we need to achieve together. We need technology development, market development, and innovation. And both Sally and Shari have talked about this. I'm sure Elena will address it too as we talk about this further, which is, we don't know how this is all going to get solved. And now, especially in 2020, we have to do it within the context of a global pandemic. So I wanted to highlight that, in fact, 155 companies, including Nestlé, we have a combined market capitalization over 2.4 trillion, and we represent over 5 million employees. The companies have signed a commitment urging governments around the world to align our COVID-19 economic aid and recovery with the latest climate science. This is so that we can advance beyond to get to transformation, essentially what Sally was saying as well. Because now more than ever, we need to understand the drivers, not just the investment needed, but how our global, national, and local economies will support and generate a carbon neutral future. That is what's so important to us. And really, from our perspective, taking this journey is about advancing where we've been, but also creating a new way of doing business. We have to begin to account for externalities, drive business from both an ethical and financial lens, and ultimately work together with our supply chains, because that's where we're going to have to go in the future. And so that's really what I wanted to share with you all about what we see as the role economists can play in helping us get there. I'll address some other aspects of that in some of our later questions.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And now Elena. You're muted.
Got it now. Thank you, Keith. Thank you to all my colleagues in AAEA. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about this super important subject. In many ways, the sustainability movement writ large, especially in business, as we just saw from Emily's comments, is moving at a pace that is hard, honestly, for us academics to keep up with. We are notoriously slow, after all, as many of us will acknowledge. Academic pace is somewhat different than the real world pace. But it's not an excuse for not trying to stay abreast of things. And I personally found that some of the news aggregation services can be really great, as well as special media sections of, for example, the New York Times and the Guardian's environmental sections. And although I've been a late adopter, Twitter can be a great source of information as well. But stepping back from these faster moving trends in sustainability, what I'd like to do is think more specifically about sustainability as a scientific area of study. And it's obvious that agricultural, environmental, and other kinds of economists are essential to this area of study. First and most obviously, we have a whole subfield within resource economics that has generated a rich literature on the economics of sustainability. Really goes back to the Club of Rome times in the 1960s, when ecologists and others became convinced that the world was running out of resources. And the very best minds in economics, starting with Robert Solow, John Hartwig, Joe Stiglitz, and then Partha Dasgupta, Jeff Heel, Marty Weitzman, many others, developed models that clarified the conditions under which we could use up natural resources, or at least some of them, and nonetheless still maintain social welfare. This early work really helped to clarify the notion of weak sustainability, and it set up productive debates with others who favored more of a strong sustainability approach. Since this time, the empirics have slowly started to catch up to the theory. Places like World Bank, United Nations, and others have pioneered measures of the kinds of indicators that Sally and others were just talking about in terms of what we might call inclusive wealth or comprehensive wealth, that account for not just the financial and produced or manufactured wealth of our nations, but also the natural capital wealth, the human capital, and the other sources of wealth that contribute to our well-being. But honestly, the economics of sustainability remains a fairly small and specialized field. It's perhaps due to the highly technical mathematical modeling that's characterized much of the work. It's been not very accessible, particularly for those outside of economics. Meanwhile, the sustainability science field as an interdisciplinary field has really exploded. There are a large and ever-growing body of work on sustainability. It's largely outside of economics, and numerous interdisciplinary journals that are now publishing this work, including specialized journals with titles like Sustainability, but also very well-known general science journals like Nature, Science, PNAS, and the now many offspring of nature journals like Nature Climate Change, Nature Energy, and even Nature Sustainability. Bill Clark, who's a geographer at Harvard University and a pioneer of this interdisciplinary area of sustainability science, defined it as being oriented by the practical problems that it addresses, specifically the problems of sustainable development, focused on scientific understanding of strongly interacting human and environmental systems, and conducted with integrated research from across multiple disciplines, natural, social, medical, engineering sciences, and as well as engaged in the world of action. I might add one more, which is reflecting many of the comments from Emily and others. It's really concerned with trade-offs and assessing social well-being and the trade-offs that occur across human and natural systems over multiple spatial scales, people, and of course across time. This is really a much broader conceptualization of the science of sustainability, but nonetheless, it's one that economists are very well positioned to engage with. We study systems, we study markets, we study public goods and externalities, we study trade-offs, we study these things over time. Ag and environmental economists have been studying interactions across human and environment for a long time, going back, to fisheries and pollution and soil health. We have scholars working in community and regional economics, international development that think hard about the trade-offs between economic growth, poverty, regional development, and the environment. But it's also a field that, because of its interdisciplinarity, extends well beyond economics. There are huge questions that go beyond just our own area of expertise, relating to ethical and moral questions about what's the reason for committing to a sustainability goal? What's the moral reason behind Nestlé committing to a net zero carbon goal? That includes questions of fairness and equity and justice. It extends well beyond just economics. Political economy questions: who wins, who loses, who has the power to implement these strategies? What about social justice as a pillar of sustainability? And I would also echo that the aspects of human behavior are so important in this: perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, differences in these things that are relevant, particularly for understanding consumption and technology adoption. And also echoing the importance of uncertainty. Sustainability is about trade-offs over time. We don't know what the future costs or the future benefits of our current actions are. How do we account for that fundamental uncertainty? We need to extend beyond frameworks of just expected utility to really understanding and grappling with true uncertainty and even ignorance of the future. And of course, the underlying of all of this is the earth and environmental system science, which is really much more complex and heterogeneous than our initial models accounted for. So the biggest thing I see going forward for economists is that we are engaging and working with others, and we just need to keep doing that and frankly do a better job of working with others. And it's hard to do. We're not incentivized often to do it. And I'll spend some more time on my next round of comments digging into that a little bit further. Thank you.
Thank you. And now back to Shari, and I have a question for her. So given your engagement with the food and ag sector, what are some of the most interesting sustainability efforts that you are seeing?
Great, thank you, Keith. So I'd like to share some very practical examples of sustainability across the supply chain. So again, clustering them around consumer behaviors and beliefs. As I mentioned, are we reaching the tipping point? And a few examples there. Protein shift. As you read in the news or you've experienced yourself, there's a lot of plant-based protein initiatives and conversations around what is sustainable protein. And then last, as I polled our stakeholders, soil health and carbon markets was their top example. So I'll be sharing an example there of some of the initiatives going on. So first, in terms of this notion of the tipping point, I'm sure all of us look at a bunch of the research that has been going on around this. And this report from IBM Institute for Business Value that just came out is one of the first ones that I've seen that indicates this shift that you see in the food sector there, especially where what they're calling purpose-driven customers being the largest segment, more so than price-based, what they are calling value-driven customers here. So that is significant, and that food, out of all the sectors, has the largest portion of consumers who are self-identifying as purpose-driven in their decisions that they make. So I think that is significant for us all, and an opportunity. So some of the examples now in terms of what's happening in the marketplace, largely driven by those millennials and others that are changing their behaviors about what they purchase. You may have read this. This just came out in Forbes in July of this year, of carbon labels happening on food. And there's some talk about, well, how much will that shift behavior? And they're looking at past labels affecting, when nutrition labels came out, that affected about 10% of the purchasing decision. So we'll see what happens with these carbon labels, but I think it's a significant thing that it's starting to happen in the marketplace. With Just Salad being one example, their corn being an example from the UK. Secondly, here in terms of another example is imperfect foods. This is one actually my daughter told me about as a millennial, that she is active and using imperfect foods. She gets her box of foods there, with the example being around reducing waste. I would like to know more about what the farmers' economic value is there. They contract directly with farmers. And the consumer value there is not only the reduced waste, they get a reduced price. And then they have that feel good in terms of the purpose-driven aspect of using that service. Second, then, in terms of these plant-based proteins, how far, how fast is really the key question that people are talking about. Is this just something going on in the US and Europe, or will we see widespread use of plant-based proteins in other markets? I'll admit I was a skeptic about China, for example, adopting plant-based proteins. But this chart on the left from McKinsey has given me some food for thought. As you may know, plant-based proteins have been launched in China with Starbucks and KFC into some partnerships. And what the chart on the left is showing is, where does meat consumption stabilize with GDP growth? And China is around the 10 point, where it says that the stabilization happens around 11. So that's why I said it's given me some pause to think that, China is further along that curve than we might realize, and could be at a state where they could start shifting more to plant-based proteins. So time will tell. But I think that is a key question: is it a US, European-based phenomenon, or will it happen in other markets like China? On the right, you may or may not know of Benson Hill. I think of them for two reasons as an example. One, with plant-based proteins, because they have developed an unusually high protein soybean for use in this market that's exploding. And then secondly, as I mentioned earlier, business innovation. Benson Hill is an example of a business innovation, how they're doing the plant breeding through their algorithms. And then secondly, the value capture for farmers being part of the core proposition there as well. So I think those are examples worth watching. Last, as I mentioned, when I polled our stakeholder group, they highlighted soil health as the key thing that's top of mind for them as an example. And what I think really has to happen here is scaling. So going beyond the early adopters to scaling. And Farm Foundation was engaged in helping stand up the Soil Health Institute and the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, two great organizations that are trying to help scale soil health and carbon markets. One thing that might need to happen there to scale it is more research on the connection between soil health and human health. Farmers are caring about soil health, and other organizations are, but we need to get consumers to care about soil health so that we can monetize that and create and share that value across the supply chain. General Mills has an initiative where they've committed to have 1 million of their supply chain acres switched to regenerative ag. And they're supporting the farmers with coaches to help them through that. So I think that's one question mark there in terms of, will consumers care about what General Mills is doing, and will that help to monetize us soil health, as well as ESMC's initiatives with the carbon markets. Time will tell, but I think that's an important piece for us all to try to help move forward. So Keith, I think that will conclude my examples.
Okay. Sally, my question for you is, please discuss the funding opportunities you see for economists wishing to engage in sustainability research.
Thanks for the question. It's an interesting question, because I actually went and tried to find out how much the United States spends on economic research, and then how much the United States actually spends on agricultural related economic research, and the numbers are not easy to come by. So although we do know it's a small proportion compared to some of the other physical and biological sciences, but it's important to recognize that a lot of what is going on with the economics research is that it's likely being part of a systems approach. So the economics is often embedded in a more systematic, interdisciplinary type funding opportunities that may come across this. And I did want to talk about a number of initiatives that we've had in our foundation. In fact, Shari mentioned two of them that I'll mention myself. And then a big initiative that we're starting to work on that I think all of you will be interested in. But if you look at some of the just basic areas, you can look at the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. They have a new systems program. They also have their AFRI program that has markets and economics and natural resources economics just as areas that you can always apply for. And actually, NSF has a whole directorate on social and economics, although if you look at what the National Science Foundation does provide, generally there's not a lot that has to do with agriculture per se, at least on farm agriculture, although there are some studies that have to do with consumer behavior and other parts of the supply chain. So our foundation has been very instrumental in starting a number of these larger initiatives that really do contain a very important economic component as part of sustainability. And Shari mentioned too the Soil Health Initiative, which we started back 3-4 years ago. A $20 million initiative. It was the largest soil health initiative ever started in this country with the Soil Health Institute. And that initiative actually is working on metrics, some of which are economic metrics. And secondly, the ecosystem service market, and we added the research consortium to that. As you know, we are looking at a number of ecosystem services, and three of them that they're starting with is the carbon sequestration, of course, and then water quality and water quantity. Those are the three they're starting with. What's really good about having the ecosystem service market, which is trying to develop a system of credits through that by 2022 they hope to have up and going. Now I think COVID's put a little monkey wrench in that. But that is really important, because if they develop appropriate ways that can get the credits market working, we believe that all sorts of other ecosystem services can be brought under the same kind of protocols that we develop these ecosystem service markets in carbon and water. So you can imagine, for bringing value back to farmers and profitability back to farmers, there's a whole host of different kinds of ecosystem services and actually on-farm activities that could bring additional value to farmers. So that's really, really important, and we were really happy to be part of that. We also worked in the plant. We just had a plant-based protein challenge as an effort to think about plant-based proteins, and we were able to fund 3 very important plant-based basic science initiatives on plant proteins. Part of that challenge, though, was to look at new kinds of plants, and we concentrated on legumes and the pulse plants, and there was an economic component to that we asked that if you're going to develop new markets for new products, that you develop those economic analyses that are going to be needed. And finally, I want to talk about a very large initiative that we are starting. We joined forces with the USFRA, so that's the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action Alliance. They were the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. Now it's U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. They just became a 501c3, and also the World Farmers Organization, to put together what we heard Emily talk about in a moment, about trying to bring together all of us in an unprecedented effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and go net negative across the agricultural sector. We know that we all are working in this area. As Shari mentioned, and as Emily mentioned, there are so many great efforts going on, but we believe that this is the time for us all to come together and try to work together to do this, and with a large force that is going to get us to this net negative as quickly as possible. And we believe that by 2030 we can do it, but it's going to take all hands on deck and all of us working together. So we ask the question, if not now, when? And if not, who? We think it can be us. And we believe that we can create this effort called Ag Mission, which is really going to be like the human genome effort, where we're all going to come together to try to do this. There are so many data out there. Those data exist. There's so many efforts out there. We're going to try to bring it all together and put together an almost $200 million initiative to get us all walking together, speaking together, visioning together. And so you'll be hearing more about this in September, the launch of Ag Mission. And we are going to be in the quiet phase of fundraising, but this is so important to take all the good that's going on out there in the world, of all the companies that are working on sustainability initiatives, all the government initiatives, the academic initiatives, and the farmers. At the heart of all this is the farmers, because they are going to be the ones that co-create with us a way to build this platform that will give them answers that will allow them to manage their farms in reducing greenhouse gases as much as possible while retaining their profitability. So you'll hear more about that. Remember Ag Mission. But for all of you, we'd be happy to talk more about this and have the economists be central to this whole effort, because of course a large piece of it is going to be what is going to work economically for not only the farmers but for the public as well. So thank you.
Thank you. I will remind our audience that if you have questions for our speakers, put them in the chat box at this time. And now I'd like to ask Emily to talk about the challenges that your firm faces to defining and validating sustainable supply chains.
Thank you, Keith. I really want to continue to build on what Shari and Sally are saying. So Shari talked about, words matter, definitions matter. And so this question is really pertinent to that. How do we define that? And I would say we've been on a journey, and it is challenging. And I think over the past about 10 years or so that our responsible sourcing program has been in place, I think we've continued to iterate what is that definition, how do we align on that, and it takes a multi-stakeholder effort. We can't at Nestlé define it alone, nor should we try, right, to define that for any particular sector or portion of our supply chain. So to give you some sense of what this means to us, we source from over 695,000 farmers globally across 90 countries. So, okay, how do you then define what sustainable agriculture or sustainability means, to each of those countries, each of those supply chains, each of those products that are coming into our factories? And the answer is you really have to work with all of them in all different ways. And I want to highlight two approaches that we've been working on and a part of. One, Sally and Shari talked about, which is the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. Nestlé is also a founding member of that organization. And again, this is a way that we can come together across multiple geographies, multiple areas of the country, and multiple crop types, as well as with animal agriculture, to try to assess how do we value some of these, what I'll call externalities, but really they're a key component of our supply chains just as much as the actual products that are coming in through our value chain. And so engaging in that helps us define as a group, what is this going to mean? How do we value it collectively? How do we understand how to pull the right levers, again, with governments, with policy, with nonprofits, with our civil society stakeholders, with our colleagues across the food industry. That's really vital to helping us get there. And we haven't always been perfect in that, right? There's been a number of efforts over the years. Those continue, as well as we go forward in these new journeys like the ESMC over the last couple of years. The other I'll highlight is called the Sustainable Dairy Partnership, led by the SCI platform, the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative. It's an involved of a number of dairy companies throughout the world. We're involved with it as well. And, really it's going to enable us as a company to help define what that systems approach is going to look like in the dairy industry. We really want to leverage and rely on some of the programming that has been established, particularly here in the US, but also globally, that helps validate and verify what's happening in dairy farms across the world without us having to do that ourselves, right? So as a replicative or duplicative effort of an individual company coming in and trying to assess each and every supply chain, how do we use these partnership approaches to try to take that investment in resources and spend it elsewhere? And that's really where we're moving going forward as Nestlé, an evolution of our programming around still being involved in definition and the journey of how that happens, still bringing the science in, while we also try to advance our own verification systems to rely more heavily on the experts within our supply chains that do that. And that enables us to spend our investment on innovation and cost sharing and value add to our supply chains to help move that needle. And that's what we really feel is going to be necessary going forward, is we can't just come in and check the box or check to see how things are going, but rather help advance that and move that going forward, right? Working in collaboration, of course, with our supply chain partners and ultimately with farmers. That is what this is all about, is to really get the farmers engaged and to get this moving all throughout the system. So I think that's where we're going. And I think it's a way to begin to address some of these challenges that we've had, which is how do you validate? How do you verify? We're ultimately trying to create a systems approach, get all involved, simplify as much as we can. And I want to speak to sort of Shari's terms of then how do we take that to the consumer? You will see a lot more communication and activation, I'll say, with consumers about this. I think General Mills is a great example, but we too have been communicating a lot more in our Creating Shared Value platform to engage consumers in that conversation. Where does your food come from? Who are the farmers that grow it? Where do they come from? But we also have to do a little bit of a detective work and digging into our supply chains to actually find those farmers. So I think it's just an opportunity, again, to come together and engage. And when we sit at the same table, we are so much more empowered to take that to the consumer when we know exactly how that's happening in our supply chains and how we can enable that to be even more impactful going forward. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Keith.
Okay. Elena, what insights have you gained as a faculty director of an interdisciplinary sustainability institute at Ohio State that spans multiple colleges and disciplines?
Thanks, Keith. The Sustainability Institute at Ohio State was launched about 1.5 years ago. And so in addition to being faculty in our department, Agricultural, Environmental Development, Economics, I'm also the faculty director for the Institute and co-directed along with our executive director. It's quite a different institute than most institutes at universities in that we span not just research and teaching, but also outreach with strong links to campus sustainability as well. So for example, we have our own climate action plan at Ohio State that we're working towards. So as part of my faculty director duties, though, I mentor and evaluate over about 30 core faculty of the Institute who have tenure homes across many different departments and disciplines, about 18 different academic departments here at OSU. And we provide partial support for these faculty, and so they have joint appointments with the Sustainability Institute. We also reach out and interact with many more affiliated faculty and researchers, close to 300. And we also reach out externally to work with partners across the state and across the nation and internationally as well. But I've seen up close the difficulties and barriers that many academics face in doing interdisciplinary work, and that's really what I wanted to address in my comments over the next couple of minutes. It's true across many disciplines, but it's particularly true in the quote unquote pure science disciplines that are most often found in, for example, College of Arts and Sciences, which would include pure economics departments, but many others as well. And so I do think that for many of us who are in more applied econ departments, such as agricultural economics or agricultural and environmental development economics, in my case, we are definitely better situated and more incentivized to do this kind of work. But the challenges of generating, evaluating, and supporting high quality interdisciplinary research are real. And at universities, much of it comes down to a process by which we evaluate scholarship, and on that basis, we promote and tenure our faculty. It also goes beyond this because much of it has to do with the norms and the culture of the specific discipline and how inclusive that discipline is of other disciplinary perspectives. To provide just some insights on this, I'm currently co-authoring a paper with Bill Yeager of Oregon State and Eli Finichel from Yale on the challenges for economists and interdisciplinary research on human natural systems. And we did a survey, perhaps some of you were actually received the survey and responded, for which we're grateful. But we surveyed a large group of environmental economists largely and natural scientists as well. We found that vast majority, over 80%, somewhat agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that there are questions that require natural scientists and economists to work together. However, we also found that many of these researchers, especially those at academic institutions and especially economists, associate higher costs with doing interdisciplinary research and perceive it to be lower quality relative to doing disciplinary research. And so this really underscores a critical gap in the value that we assign to interdisciplinary research. There's broad recognition that someone needs to do it, but this value is not fully reflected in the individual rewards that faculty are getting or the value that many of these individual researchers are associating with this kind of work. So in the paper, we develop a conceptual framework drawing on Arrow's Limits to Organization treatise from 1974. I don't have time to go into it all, but it really looks at the economics of information and coding uncertain information. So again, this role of uncertainty plays a big role. And disciplines are really efficient and really good at this, but for the same reason, it creates barriers to doing interdisciplinary work. So we explore also the consequences. We discuss some ways in which organizations can overcome these barriers. But really the bottom line is that it transcends the efforts of any one individual organization. So this is kind of the common theme, I feel, of our panel. It's like we need all hands on deck to solve these problems. We need not just individual universities or other research organizations, but we need professional associations like AAEA and other groups. We need industry, we need other associations beyond just economics to properly incentivize and support and evaluate high quality interdisciplinary research that also values other kinds of contributions as well to helping solve real world problems and extending our work beyond just academic journals. A bright spot is some of the funding that's been available. Hearing the funding that FAR has put on the table from Sally is really exciting. NSF is another example of this. They've really done a lot to help drive research on coupled human natural systems. And there are lots of universities that are doing things. At OSU, as I mentioned, we have joint appointments with many faculty in many different disciplines, but many challenges still remain, and I don't have time to elaborate any further on these right now. In closing, I did want to just say that despite the challenges, it's clear to most people at universities and certainly outside of universities that more interdisciplinary research is needed to truly solve these challenges of sustainability. And so thinking beyond just the academic challenges of publishing and promotion and tenure barriers, economists at universities have real incentives to do this. Clearly, in doing so, we will generate new demand for our work, new markets for our research, new opportunities to not just engage with other scientists and researchers, but to forge partnerships with industry, businesses, governments, and other research organizations in ways that if we just stick to doing economics on our own, we won't have those kinds of opportunities. And really this forum has been a great opportunity to learn more about what some of these key driving questions are and ways in which economists can plug in. And finally, I'd say that doing this kind of work is super critical for supporting our students, the mission of our academic programs, and honestly for keeping universities relevant, particularly in this age where it's only just going to accelerate in terms of the lagging number of traditional college students in this post-COVID age of distance learning and remote working. So we really owe it to our students to give this kind of real world training in terms of learning how to translate economics knowledge and their tremendous data and applied skills that they have to applying them to working with real world challenges and sustainability, and working not just in teams, but working with scientists from other disciplines, engineers, and also working with external partners. to prepare them for that real work in the real world. So by organizing our academic programs, our courses, solving these real world problems, we can help to ensure that we're serving the needs of all of our students, and we're being responsive to the broader societal commitments that many of our institutions have, especially those of us who are coming from the land-grant tradition.
Okay, I want to turn to some questions, and I'm going to direct this first one to Emily. One of the participants is asking, you know, we've talked a lot about consumers and producers in this hour, but what about laborers and the vulnerability with respect to COVID-19? What do we do about them?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's something that you know, we're definitely monitoring and involved in, and I think there's a lot of opportunity both at the local level, integrating with the state level. You see some states activating in creating policies and protections for ag farm workers. And I think this also links to a lot of what Shari and Sally have talked about in terms of how we really pull all levers and try to transform the ways that we're doing business in the future. So I think that is something that is a broad question of how we address this across our ag community, across the populations of folks that are necessary in our systems to achieve what we need to harvest what we need. And from our perspective at Nestlé, it really is about the ethical standards that we expect our supply chains to uphold in terms of protecting workers, in terms of upholding and managing and mitigating those situations as best as possible and as the science continues to evolve, right? So paying attention to that, paying attention to the guidelines and the protections and orders. It's a very dynamic system right now, very dynamic process. And so I think it's just not a one size fits all. It's got to be very much a combination of strategies across government, private, supply chain sectors. And from our perspective, the health and safety of workers is of the utmost importance, and it's our expectation through our responsible sourcing program and our expectation of all suppliers to uphold that. So we know it's a complicated system and an evolving situation, but we're definitely continuing to monitor and watch it.
Keith, I might just add, we're seeing increased automation and mechanization as one result of COVID. Whether it's that workers don't want to come to work for their own safety, or if it's just that for the it's triggering increased mechanization and automation.
Okay. I want to run to another question, and that it has to do with, and any of you can answer this that want to, but the fact that to do large multidisciplinary kind of research would seem to take large funding that would allow a large team, as you all have described, to work on a problem. And yet one of the questions kind of struggles with the fact that oftentimes it seems like we can't put together a large enough funding package to bring all the people together that we need. Sally, you want the first shot?
Yeah, I can start with that. I have to agree with that. I think particularly in agriculture, where funding, it comes from a very diffuse sources. So government, private sector, foundations, academic state funds, commodity organizations. It's oftentimes piecemealing to try to get these big things together. Now there are a few efforts like the NIFA systems approach, but compared to some other federal agencies that put $100 million initiative together pretty quickly, it's much harder in agriculture, I think. The other thing that I think happens is that oftentimes we sort of force collaborations among disciplines where we, instead of letting it naturally let the problem drive it. I think if you have the best way really to get a larger amount of funding is to have a very, very important, essential kind of question and bring together the most important people. I mean, the most important disciplines and the most appropriate disciplines together, and not to try to force fit. I see so many funding announcements that says this must be multidisciplinary. At our foundation, we try to take the other approach to say, We're just going to put the problem out there that we need to solve, and then we're going to judge you on having the most appropriate teams together. I think that oftentimes can lead to it. But no, our big effort for Ag Mission is going to be about a $200 million effort. And that even seems small in my mind for the size and scope of what we're trying to do. But we are trying to put together a big effort because, as we all know, funding can really drive the success of these efforts.
And Sally, I want to follow up with another question in here. You talked about transformation versus sustainability. How do we prioritize between those two?
Well, I mean, I sort of think it's been very interesting evolution because I've been in the, you know, I was 30 years with the federal government when I first started at NIFA, what was NIFA back in the day. Remember, we had a meeting on sustainability, and sustainability at the time was a difficult word for a lot of people. You know, now it's so much more commonplace, and we all have our sustainability goals. But in order to meet those, the term sustainability means, you know, status quo. And that's why I really think that we have to think about transformation. And we all talked about it here. Shari talked about it, and Emily talked about it, and Lena talked about it. It really is about transforming from where we are today into that futuristic system that we're going to get what we need, either by environmental impact or by new healthy food sources, or by the whole supply chain, you know, being in sync with each other. So I don't think we can really separate it this really carefully to make a distinction between the two, but I do believe that all of the hard work that's gone into our sustainability up this point is now leading to that next step, which is transformation.
Okay, well, I see that the next panel is in the room. And so I want to thank our panelists in this session so much for being willing to participate. And we will bring this to a close. And hopefully AAEA members will continue to participate in our virtual events today and tomorrow. Thank you.